Millions watched in awe. Trumpets blared, the crown glistened, and the world stood still. But what cameras didn't show, what palace insiders whispered behind marble doors, was a chain of events that would tear open the gilded veil of monarchy. The truth didn't lie in the crown, it hid in the shadows surrounding it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The coronation of King Charles was hailed as a moment of grandeur and unity, a symbol of continuity in an era desperate for reassurance. Across continents, televisions beamed images of a monarch stepping into destiny, cloaked in centuries of tradition. Royal trumpets echoed through Westminster Abbey. Every camera angle was pre-approved, every step choreographed to perfection. But beneath that facade of control, cracks were beginning to surface, ones that couldn't be glossed over with diamonds or history. Body language experts immediately noticed something off. Not in the king, but in those closest to him. Camilla, newly titled Queen, maintained a stiff, controlled expression. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and when the crown was lowered onto her head, she didn't blink. Not out of reverence, but restraint. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at a calculated distance. Supportive, yes, but measured, quiet, and emotionally unreadable. There was no casual glance exchanged between them, no warm acknowledgement. The silence between their glances spoke volumes, but no one dared translate it aloud. Then came the whispers about a mysterious delay no broadcaster mentioned. The Queen's personal box, said to contain private heirlooms and ceremonial artifacts, arrived several hours later than scheduled. Palace aides scrambled, with timelines shifting behind velvet curtains. Eyewitnesses from within the abbey claimed a completely different order of arrival was prepared earlier that morning, only to be scrapped minutes before the cameras rolled. A sudden shift in procession placement saw Catherine placed in more prominent positioning than originally intended, raising questions among even seasoned observers. None of this was reflected in the press releases. Official statements maintained the illusion, but something didn't align. Why were senior staff seen huddling with Catherine's private secretary minutes before the royal entrance? Why did a senior guard stationed at the vault vanish from his post hours earlier, never returning until after the ceremony? Why did Charles glance nervously over his shoulder as he took his seat? This was not the image of a united monarchy, but a carefully constructed illusion desperately holding its seams together. As Britain applauded and headlines glorified, a different story began to take shape quietly and dangerously. The stage had been set, not for a celebration, but for a reckoning. There were things the public wasn't supposed to see, things buried beneath royal rituals and golden carriages, but they were about to surface, because someone who had stood behind the curtains had decided to speak. But as the world celebrated, an insider with unprecedented access would soon break their silence, revealing a secret rehearsed not in ceremony, but in betrayal. She never planned to speak. Sworn to silence by tradition, duty, and fear. But when a private journal entry was leaked, her identity was exposed, and so was everything she witnessed from the heart of the palace's hidden core. They called her Sparrow inside the palace, an affectionate nickname given by the late Queen for her quiet loyalty and ever-watchful presence. Few outside the royal household had ever heard of her, yet behind the scenes, she was everywhere. She carried no titles, wore no medals, but held access to every corridor where power moved. For over 2 decades, she shadowed the most sacred of royal duties, never stepping into the spotlight, never leaving a trace. But everything changed when the coronation began to unravel from within. Her role in the event was pivotal, though intentionally understated. Sparrow had been tasked with overseeing confidential logistics, coordinating timing, personnel, ceremonial transitions. She was a thread holding together centuries of protocol. But in the 72 hours leading up to the coronation, something changed. She was summoned to a discreet meeting with senior aides, not in the official chambers, but in an unmarked briefing room she had never entered before. The tone was different, hushed, clipped, almost fearful. A list of changes was handed to her, printed on unmarked paper. Her instructions were simple yet chilling. Timelines were to be altered, access points restricted, and certain individuals were no longer permitted to enter the western wing of the palace after 8 p.m. No explanation, no questions allowed. Just one final sentence etched at the bottom of the page. The crown must not tremble. That phrase echoed in her ears for days. Sparrow had heard royal mottos and ceremonial codes her entire career, but this was different. It wasn't a message meant for reassurance, it was a warning. And when a whispered conversation between two aides mentioned Camilla's demand being approved without consultation, the implications grew darker. On the morning of the coronation, she watched as a sealed box was rerouted away from the Queen's quarters. Its contents were unknown, but it was escorted by two security officers she had never seen before, both dressed in plain black and answering to no one from the official registry. The turning point came when her private journal, where she had recorded every irregularity for her own peace of mind, was copied and leaked anonymously to the press. A single passage, one she never imagined anyone would read, caught fire. "If the people knew what I saw, the crown would fall." Her codename was traced, her anonymity was gone, and with it, her silence. But she didn't run. She didn't deny. She did what no royal aide had dared in modern times. She spoke. In a locked-door interview, Sparrow described her breaking point not as vengeance, but a moral reckoning. "It wasn't about protecting the crown anymore," she said softly. "It was about protecting the truth from being buried beneath it." Her confession sent ripples through the highest levels of Buckingham Palace. Old guards panicked, communications went dark, and suddenly, the fairy tale coronation began to look more like a carefully rehearsed performance built on shaky ground. And with her courage came the avalanche, one hidden chapter after another tumbling out of Buckingham's stone silence. The night before the coronation, Camilla sat in the rehearsal throne, but when the crown was presented, she didn't lift her hand. What followed stunned the room, a whispered refusal, a private meltdown, and an ultimatum that changed the entire ceremony. Only 5 people were present during that final midnight rehearsal, handpicked and sworn to discretion. The palace lights were dimmed, the chapel sealed off. This was not for show. This was the crown's final test, and it was supposed to be silent, seamless, sacred. But as Camilla lowered herself onto the ceremonial throne, something inside her snapped. When the crown was offered, she froze. The aide holding it trembled. Seconds passed. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she uttered words that fractured the room's stillness. "This isn't mine." Not truly. No one moved. The protocol officer, one of the most senior in royal service, stepped forward to prompt her, reminding her of the symbolic importance. Camilla's gaze hardened. What began as a moment of doubt turned into confrontation. She pushed the crown away with a subtle but deliberate motion, standing and turning her back to the throne. What followed was an emotional storm few dared to repeat, but fragments leaked. Words like pawn, pretense, and a stolen role were whispered behind closed doors. The officer pleaded, reminding her of the years of preparation, but she was no longer listening. Then came the moment that changed everything. Catherine appeared quietly, unexpectedly, from the side chamber. Whether she had been invited or arrived by her own design remains unanswered. Camilla's expression changed instantly. What began as doubt curdled into something colder. The air between the two women thickened with unspoken rivalry. According to sources present, Catherine said nothing, just observed, but her presence was enough to spark the next explosion. Camilla pointed at the crown jewels resting on the red cushion and said it outright. "They had these altered, didn't they?" Sized for her. "Not me." There was no response, but the silence was confirmation enough. The rehearsal was abandoned, the throne left empty. Camilla stormed from the chamber, flanked by her aide. Before the doors closed, she issued one final line, heard by everyone, and echoed through the palace by morning. "I won't wear what's been stolen." Staff scrambled to revise the ceremonial script, alter camera positions, and inform the king without triggering a full collapse of the event. The narrative to the public was preserved, but behind the scenes, chaos reigned. What was supposed to be a crowning moment had turned into a confrontation soaked in legacy, jealousy, and fear of being replaced. And through it all, Catherine remained untouched by the fire, quiet, composed, watching. But Camilla's hesitation wasn't the only disruption. Something darker was already unfolding beneath the palace floors. At 2:14 a.m., the night before the coronation, alarms sounded inside Windsor's private vault. A historic item was missing, one so sensitive, it triggered an immediate lockdown. Few knew what vanished. Even fewer knew why it mattered. Behind the opulence of the crown's final preparations, the royal family was thrown into a crisis no protocol had prepared them for. Deep within Windsor Castle, past corridors, not even the most senior aides routinely accessed, lay a vault reserved for only the most sacred items of the monarchy. When the silent alarm triggered, a code red was initiated. No one in or out, guards rushed in, protocol officers called upstairs. Within minutes, it was confirmed the vault had been breached. Missing: Queen Elizabeth II's handwritten coronation oath and the royal seal she had carried with her through 7 decades of reign. Together, they represented more than sentiment. They were symbols of sovereign continuity, and without them, the coronation was at risk of being seen as incomplete, illegitimate, even by some constitutional scholars. By 3 a.m., King Charles was roused from his chambers and informed. He was, according to insiders, visibly shaken, almost in disbelief. His voice cracked as he asked the unthinkable, was this sabotage? But before that question could be answered, another shock came. Catherine had been seen leaving the restricted West Wing hours before the breach, escorted by 2 unidentified security officers. She had clearance, yes. But her presence that late, in that section, with no public record of an assignment, raised eyebrows behind closed doors. The whispers began to grow louder. As the royal household scrambled to resecure the area, Camilla issued a direct order to her private staff. Full lockdown of her office. No one was to touch her belongings. She cited misplaced heirlooms and inventory chaos. But to those observing closely, it appeared more like damage control than protection. Some claim she was seen shredding documents. Others believe she was hiding something of her own, something tied to the very item now gone. All of it swirled in secrecy, yet the panic was unmistakable. What was supposed to be a night of final rehearsals and quiet anticipation had turned into a silent war of suspicions and frantic cover-ups. Behind closed doors, the theory that began to surface chilled even the most hardened insiders. What if someone didn't want the original coronation vow, the one handwritten by Queen Elizabeth, to be read or revealed? What if its contents contradicted the new narrative being shaped by those ascending the throne? No answers were offered, no explanations confirmed, but the timing was too precise, the implications too dangerous to ignore. The cameras were still being mounted outside Westminster, the golden robes were still being pressed, but inside the palace, trust was disintegrating. Allies became suspects, rooms were swept for surveillance, whispers of betrayal replaced prayers for unity. And still, the crown waited. As panic surged behind palace walls, a long-buried rivalry reignited, one that had been boiling since the moment Charles became king. This wasn't about titles, it wasn't even about Charles. It was about legacy, lineage, and a quiet war between 2 women vying to define the monarchy's next chapter with or without a crown on their head. Long before the coronation was even announced, there was a balancing act playing out behind the palace walls, one that had nothing to do with thrones or scepters and everything to do with influence. Camilla, the woman who had once stood in Diana's shadow, had finally secured her place beside the king. Yet even that victory felt fragile. Across the palace grounds and in the public consciousness, another figure had been rising not through force or scandal, but through grace, consistency, and something far more dangerous: public adoration. Catherine wasn't just the Princess of Wales. She had become the unspoken symbol of the monarchy's future. As the world mourned Queen Elizabeth, the shift was almost imperceptible at first. But within weeks, invitations to state events began arriving with a new pattern. Catherine was positioned more centrally. asked to speak more publicly, encouraged to stand where once only the sovereign did. Every move seemed minor, but the accumulation was unmistakable. And Camilla noticed. Those close to her say she began voicing concerns behind closed doors, claiming that tradition was being reshaped in Catherine's image. What had taken her decades to secure, she feared, could be undone in a single wave of public sentiment. Then came the leaked memo. A confidential document from the palace strategy office surfaced, suggesting that Catherine's team had been instructed to prepare for an expanded ceremonial future. It was subtle, but explosive. What did expanded mean? And why now? Camilla's reaction was swift and sharp. According to one aide, she demanded the document be retracted and rewrites approved through her office. That same week, Catherine's family was quietly removed from the guest list of a pre-coronation gala. No explanation, no apology, just a silent message delivered through protocol. Not everyone would be made to feel welcome, but the tension didn't stay behind the scenes. Those who observed closely saw it leak into posture, presence, and expression. At a charity event, when a reporter mistakenly referred to Catherine as the future queen, Camilla reportedly muttered under her breath, "She's not my queen in waiting." And while Catherine didn't respond, her silence carried weight. In the court of public opinion, the tide was already turning. Polls began to show a startling trend when asked who best embodied the spirit of the crown. Catherine's name outshone both Charles and Camilla. It wasn't rebellion, it was preference. And that, in a monarchy ruled as much by perception as bloodline, was a devastating shift. What had begun as a shared mission to support the king became a cold contest to shape what would come after him. Each appearance became a performance, each absence a calculated move. And while the public was fed smiling portraits and choreographed warmth behind palace doors, the frost between Catherine and Camilla deepened. Two women, bound by duty but divided by destiny, had stepped onto a path where only one legacy could truly take root. But while the palace managed to suppress these tensions in daylight, it couldn't contain what happened just before the coronation began. When the official coronation order of service was printed, one man noticed something off. His refusal to follow the altered script sparked a quiet rebellion that nearly derailed the ceremony on live television. The Lord Chancellor had rehearsed the moment countless times. A seasoned guardian of constitutional protocol, he had served under Queen Elizabeth and was known for his unshakable precision. His duty during the coronation was vital. He was to introduce key ceremonial transitions, validate the monarch's oath, and ensure that nothing, not even sentiment, disrupted the line of lawful ascension. But hours before the ceremony began, a final version of the official script was placed in his hands, and something wasn't right. The phrasing had shifted, the names were repositioned. The structure, though subtly changed, no longer reflected the sacred balance between tradition and transparency. One line in particular stood out. A key vow had been quietly reworded, replacing an age-old phrase of collective duty with a more individualistic promise, one that shifted weight away from service to the people and closer toward personal sovereignty. Another change demoted the order in which key figures were acknowledged, placing Camilla's title in prominence over others who had historically preceded her. These weren't typographical errors. These were intentional adjustments, polished and printed for execution without consultation, and the Lord Chancellor sworn to serve the crown, not the whims of palace politics, refused. Backstage, tensions exploded. In a confrontation unseen by the cameras, he demanded answers from the senior palace advisor responsible for script coordination. Raised voices echoed in the marble corridor behind the abbey's altar. Accusations were thrown, names invoked. The Chancellor held his ground. "This script has been tampered with," he declared. "I will not read lies to the nation." Word reached the king's team within minutes. But the real storm broke when it was revealed that the alterations had been approved by Camilla's office just hours before printing. Her team denied orchestrating a narrative shift, but sources claim this wasn't the first time they had pushed for more ceremonial emphasis on her role, and this time, it had gone too far. The standoff threatened to delay the entire ceremony, Silence fell across the chapel. And then Catherine stepped forward, calm, composed, and carrying none of the weight of panic that had gripped the others. She reviewed the altered lines, said nothing for a moment, then quietly turned to the Lord Chancellor and said, "Then let truth stand as written." Her words, simple but immovable, cut through the chaos. With her backing, the original script was reinstated, and the Lord Chancellor agreed to proceed. But the damage had already been done. The chain of trust between ceremonial leadership and palace advisors had fractured in real time. Behind every line spoken that day now lingered the awareness of what almost wasn't. But as the procession moved forward, so did a second drama unseen by millions, yet unfolding in real time within the royal family itself. As the church bells rang, William pulled his father aside. What he whispered wasn't part of any script, and it left Charles pale, trembling, and on the verge of collapse. 40 minutes before the coronation was set to begin, as final touches were being made, and dignitaries began to fill the pews, a storm of a different kind was quietly erupting behind the heavy doors of the king's private chamber. William had asked for a moment alone with his father, not as heir to the throne, not even as Prince of Wales, but as a son, a protector of legacy, and some say as a man prepared to draw the line. Their conversation was short, tense, and, as leaked reports would later claim, utterly devastating. According to lip readers stationed discreetly for media coverage, William's words were unambiguous. "If she's named Queen, I walk." The blow landed hard. Charles's reaction, visible only to a handful of stunned staff, was immediate. He sat down, clutched the edge of the table, and seemed to drift somewhere between fury and heartbreak. For years, he had fought to legitimize Camilla's role, weathering public scorn, rebuilding her image, reworking history itself. And now, on the morning that was to cement his legacy, his eldest son, the very future of the monarchy, was threatening to upend it all with a single refusal. The moment was fragile. If William stepped back, the narrative would implode. The unity Charles had so desperately crafted would dissolve. The entire ceremony risked descending into farce. Palace aides stood frozen. One reached for the door. But before chaos could unfold, Princess Anne arrived, calm, unwavering, and as sharp as ever. She dismissed everyone and closed the door behind her. What was said in that room between the king, his son, and his sister remains unconfirmed. But when the door reopened, Charles was changed. Not calmed, resigned. His hands shook as he buttoned his collar, his face pale but determined. Not spoken aloud, not acknowledged in the official record, but bound in silence. Rumors soon emerged of a sealed document, a private accord. Some claimed it was a handwritten letter Charles signed minutes before leaving the chamber. Others whispered it was a legal agreement that redefined Camilla's role post-coronation, limiting her ceremonial influence and barring any future attempt to shift the line of succession. Whether truth or speculation, the shift was visible. During the ceremony, Charles barely looked at Camilla. His words were clipped, his movements robotic. And William? Silent, steady, ever present, but never once engaging with Camilla beyond what duty required. To the public, it looked like nerves. To the palace, it was survival. A deal had been struck in shadows. A compromise, forged in whispered threats. And though the coronation continued as planned, the air around the royal family was electric with what had almost happened and what might still come. But the most damning revelation came not from a royal nor a document, but from a camera no one knew was recording. It was supposed to be muted. An accidental live mic on a senior aide captured a chilling exchange, one that could rewrite the meaning of the entire coronation day. 2 weeks after the grand ceremony, as the palace resumed its carefully curated rhythm, a junior technician at the state broadcast agency was conducting routine archival reviews of coronation footage. His job was simple: log timestamps, remove background noise, and finalize material for the royal archive. But deep in the uncut backstage reel, buried beneath static and shuffle, something startling emerged: audio that was never meant to exist. The microphone, clipped discreetly to a senior aide's collar for reference purposes, had remained hot. It recorded not ceremony, not applause, but a conversation, hushed and sharp-edged, that shattered every illusion of unity the coronation had been built upon. The voice was unmistakable. One of the king's top aides, speaking to a figure whose identity remains blurred, uttered a phrase that would rattle the foundation of trust within the monarchy's inner circle. "It's done. She'll never touch the throne again." The tone wasn't anxious or speculative, it was certain. Final. As if a calculated mission had reached its intended conclusion. Analysts and lip readers later matched this exchange to the precise moment just after Camilla stepped away from the main chamber, her demeanor visibly shaken. The implication? That this wasn't merely ceremonial anxiety, it was the aftermath of a strategic removal. But the most chilling part wasn't just what was said, it was who was mentioned next. Barely audible, but unmistakably spoken, was a name that sent shivers down the technician's spine. Catherine. The true heir has her moment. That whisper, buried beneath fabric and background movement, was not an accident. It was a quiet acknowledgement of a power shift no royal decree had yet formalized. Within hours, the technician reported the clip to his supervisor. Within 48 hours, he had been transferred to a different department. The footage was seized. All logs redacted. What had been recorded was now classified, sealed under a rarely used clause, National Image Protection. The public, of course, saw none of this. What they were shown was a celebration of continuity. But behind the smiles and orchestras, a different reality had taken root. A reality in which private whispers carried more weight than public vows. Where mics, not monarchs, told the truth. Some insiders believe the aide in question was quietly removed from royal service. Others say they were promoted to keep them close, contained, controlled. No official statement has ever addressed the recording. No denial. No confirmation. Just silence. And that silence has become its own kind of confession. Because while the nation celebrated the coronation as the end of one era and the beginning of another, this recording suggested a far more provocative truth. That the real coronation, the one unseen, unspoken, and unsanctioned, had already taken place. And it didn't involve crowns. It involved control. And yet, even this wouldn't be the last twist, because what Catherine did next would leave the monarchy forever changed. She never needed to wear the crown to own it. Catherine's quiet mastery of image, loyalty, and legacy would outlast the ceremony and those who tried to overshadow her. In the end, history would remember not who was crowned, but who was followed. In the days after the coronation, the headlines should have been about the king, about Camilla, about the ancient spectacle that had just unfolded in grand tradition. But they weren't. From the front pages of broadsheets to the viral corners of social media, one name dominated the narrative: Catherine. It was her elegance, her restraint, her poised silence in the eye of the storm that captivated the world. Analysts called it grace. Strategists called it precision. But to the people, it was something more powerful. It was authenticity. She had stood not in the spotlight, but in its shadow, and still managed to steal every frame. Not with noise, but with presence. Camilla, once presented as the woman finally stepping into her rightful role, faded quickly from view. Her schedule was quietly scaled back, engagements cancelled, appearances postponed. When questioned, aides cited exhaustion, adjustment, privacy, but those inside the palace whispered another truth. Camilla had become a symbol of controversy, and the monarchy, eager to protect its image, was retreating from her reign before it ever took hold. Behind palace gates, a reordering had begun. Ceremonial duties once expected to be hers were reassigned. Invitations now went through Catherine's office. The Queen Consort may have held the title, but it was the princess who held the people. Polls surged with a message impossible to ignore. When asked who best embodied the future of the monarchy, the answer was nearly unanimous: Catherine. Not out of pity, not from pageantry, but from something deeper trust. After decades of scandal, loss, and shifting allegiances, The nation saw in her something it hadn't felt in years: stability, dignity, hope, and that hope translated into action. Insiders reported that Charles, recognizing the tide, quietly granted Catherine expanded ceremonial authority, placing her at the center of state matters that once bypassed her station. She did not demand power. It was offered because power, real power, never needs to shout. In private, the royal household began a subtle reshuffle. Staff who once answered to Camilla were reassigned. Budgets were shifted. Roles redefined. No formal statements were made, but the hierarchy had evolved. Catherine's team now held keys to the kingdom's future, not in bloodline alone, but in operational control. And in this silence, a final whisper emerged from the same insider who had dared to leak the first thread of truth. The coronation was never about Charles, she said. It was her ascension, in plain sight. And so, while the crown found one head, the people crowned another, and that, dear viewer, is the truth they never meant for you to see. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.